Good morning, everyone. I'm very happy that there are a few people more than in the General Council meeting, which was opened for every participant of the conference, but there have been not so many of you. But nevertheless, a warm welcome for this next part of the conference. It's quite an interesting part because we are talking about this book, The Emergence of the European Prison Education Association. So please, they are on the tables. Take one for you, and if you think, okay, my colleague could be interested too, take two. We want them to bring home again, so please be generous in distributing this book to others you think they are interested in. So we have the great honor to have the first official chair of the EPEA with us, Kevin Warner. He pre-produced a commented PowerPoint presentation we show you first, and then he will be with us online video call. So we will talk about the book, the contents of the book, and you are invited to ask him also things you are interested in. So please feel free then to ask for the microphone so that it becomes a bit more lively in this forum. Kevin Warner has worked for many years as a teacher in schools and in adult education in Ireland in the 70s. He was a national coordinator then of prison education in Ireland for 30 years until 2009, during which time he chaired also the Council of Europe Select Committee that produced or redacted the education in prison rules or recommendation. And then he was, as I already said, the founding chairperson of the EPEA from 91 to 96. He then also was very much linked to our colleagues in the USA. He was a Fulbright scholar at the Center for Study of Correctional Education in San Bernardino, California, and an international representative on the board of the Correctional Education Association from 98 to 2002. And he received a PhD in 2009 for research into Nordic penal policy, which focused especially on prison regime. So you see a whole life dedicated to education, and in particular to education in prison. So I'm really keen to hear and see what Kevin will tell us. I don't see you at the moment, Kevin, but welcome to the EPEA conference, and we may start then your presentation. Thank you.
Well, greetings to all of you in Tunsberg in Norway from County Wicklow in Ireland. On my own behalf and on behalf of my fellow authors who are Torfinn Langlid from Norway, Kai Rondrup from Denmark, and Sven Svensson from Sweden, I want to say that we appreciate the opportunity to speak to this conference about the book we've produced, The Emergence of the EPEA. And we're especially thankful to the Norwegian hosts for making a hard copy of the book available to every one of you participating in Tunsberg. In this talk, I hope I can stimulate you to take a close look at the book and hopefully gain an appreciation of how the EPEA emerged over time, and especially the philosophy that lay behind its founding. I hope that there is much that you will find interesting in the book. Matters such as separate early developments in international cooperation in the 1970s and 1980s that took place through initiatives in the Nordic countries, in England, and Cyprus, and Germany. Or the important contributions of people from North America to the organization over the years. Or how after the Berlin Wall fell in 1981, the EPA was a small part of a great swirl of new interaction between East and West. Or the great help given in this century by the European Union, and Alan Smith in particular. In researching for the book, each of the authors was struck by certain episodes. I was especially taken by the Finnish woman, Sinikka Metsähäti, who had worked as a prison teacher in Helsinki. We're talking now about the 1970s, but with little support from prison authorities. But when she obtained a new job with the Nordic Folk Academy in Kungalv, she used this position to promote the first Nordic gathering on education in prison, which took place in that Swedish city in 1977. I was also very moved by the story of Herbert Hilkenbach, who founded the German Organization of Prison Teachers. Herbert began to teach in a youth prison as far back as 1957, giving 6 hours of lessons each Saturday to up to 40 young prisoners. The classroom was a large communal cell where prisoners slept. Each Saturday it was cleared out and prisoners came in for their lessons, each with a 3-legged stool carried from his own cell. The young men used these stools to write on while kneeling before them, using pencils rather than pens. Apparently the authorities would not allow pens for fear they would be used to make tattoos. There are many more stories of this kind in the book, from those early years and from EPEA conferences in later decades, and I hope these will interest you. However, in this talk, I'm going to focus on just 2 aspects of the EPEA story, which go to the heart, I think, of the values and thinking that underpin its development. Firstly, I want to talk about the kind of organisation those involved in the early decades envisaged. Secondly, I will explore the special concept of education in prison that the EPEA was set up to promote. For education in prison is not just one thing. So each of these 2 ideas I'll explore has been seriously challenged in recent times. If one person can be said to have set events in motion that would lead to the establishment of the EPEA, it was an English prison teacher, Pam Bedford. In the very first newsletter of the EPEA in 1991, Pam set out its purpose as being, and I'm quoting, to support and assist the professional development of persons involved in prison education through European cooperation. And from the beginning, the primary focus was on educators working on the ground. This term meant those in daily contact with prisoners. Pam explained that prison educators have, and again I'm quoting, much in common in their specialist and often isolated field and welcome the opportunity to share experience and develop ideas together. The title of 2 chapters in the book begins with the phrase, reaching out and making connections. And these chapters deal with the constitution, the structures, and tools for communication that were built up in the early years to facilitate that core purpose of educators in prison making meaningful contact with each other. The vision was of a membership-focused, participative, accountable, Europe-wide body. So what the EPEA was to be can be summarized in principles: membership-focused and membership-driven, involving as many members as possible. Europe-wide, involving all European countries, and indeed beyond. Democratic and participative. Members would elect the steering committee and would shape the EPEA and its direction. Accountable. Members would have full information, including financial information. It would follow recognised good governance practice, such as time limits on the steering committee. That last point was strongly pushed by Robert Suval from the Netherlands, who was a key founder member of the EPEA. He used to complain strongly about other European organisations that had become dominated by cliques and whose leadership hardly ever changed, and he did not want the EPEA to become like that. The belief in the early decades was that these ideas were important to the EPEA if the EPEA was to facilitate its mission of sharing experience and developing ideas together. Now, in the book, we are critical of what we see as a falling away from such principles. In recent years, at the end of chapter 6, we refer to what we call a lowering of horizons. And the end of chapter 11, we are very critical of the thinking in Vision 2025. Some may want to dismiss these concerns as those of grumpy old men. And we are old and we can be a bit grumpy, but we still think these issues require serious consideration. For example, it is surely of serious concern when only the 7 countries which have branches can now fully participate in the EPEA. And for some of these 7, such as Germany, the links seem very weak. It is of concern also that there seems to be little awareness of how many members there are in the EPEA and who they are. It is a concern that for a period recently, not one of those who were acting as officers had been elected by the members. And it is of concern that it is many, many years since there was full financial accountability to the members at a General Council meeting or indeed anywhere else. But to be more positive, I want to give 2 examples from the past of what a membership-focused and membership-driven organisation looks like. Between 2000 and 2005, 5 directories were produced by the membership secretary. Each listed the name, role and contact details of every member in order to facilitate the contact I've been talking about, contact and interaction between prison educators. Each member got a printed copy of each of those 5 books. Or look at the participative process by which a strategic plan called Vision 2006 and regular action plans and reviews conducted around the strategy were developed in the years between 1997 and 2006. The wider membership was extensively involved in those processes, especially through special meetings of liaison persons. In earlier years, 2 liaison persons represented every country with EPEA membership. A similar inclusive process happened in the lead up to the revision of the Constitution under Anne Costello in 2007, with members helping to shape proposals for change. By contrast, Vision 2025, which features prominently on the EPEA website these days, lacks such a democratic mandate, as well as having other shortcomings which we describe in the final chapter. The second aspect of the book which I'd like to focus on is the question of what we mean by education in prison. Here the challenge is very much external to the EPEA. In many countries, the purpose and role of education in prison has been reduced and redirected as penal policy has shifted, and a much more punitive culture has become embedded in many places. We refer to this challenge frequently throughout the book. Perhaps I can best illustrate two very different approaches by prison authorities to education in prison, by contrasting policy statements from Norway and England in the same year, 2005. The official Norwegian approach reflects the Council of Europe thinking on education in prison, which the EPEA was founded to promote. Education is a right which all in prison have. Its purpose is the development of the person in the same way as it would be outside. The official English perspective is very limited. It is a punitive and restrictive system, and in this punitive and restrictive system, education is seen mainly as a tool to reduce reoffending. By the way, in making this contrast between different official outlooks, I'm not saying everything is perfect in Norway and poor in England. I am merely illustrating very different thinking among those who run prison systems. In fact, a recent article on music in Norwegian prisons notes how, for some, notably women and foreign prisoners, access to this cultural activity is in practice often a reward rather than a right. And that's the title of the article by Anya Mangwan. Likewise, in England these days, there is some extraordinarily good education work going on, such as that promoted by Prison Education Trust, initiatives with universities, and much else. But these admirable and in some ways heroic efforts are small in relation to an overlarge, punitive, restrictive, and overcrowded system. My purpose here is not to rank countries, but to draw attention to the importance of overall penal policy and to show that there are at least two very contrasting approaches which greatly affect the scope of education. Often, this different thinking can be seen in contrasting understandings of the word rehabilitation, which Cormac Behan has written about so well. He explains how at times so-called rehabilitation can be little short of brainwashing, but at other times a liberating, person-centred process similar to adult education. A shift in penal policy thinking in the Netherlands, for example, based on what works thinking, is described by Katinka Reniers in our chapter on the directors' conferences. As a consequence, the education available in Dutch prisons was greatly reduced. There is now only a very limited curriculum, with the arts and library services totally removed. Of course, many countries lie between these two poles. In Ireland, for example, education is seen by those who run the prison system, the Director Generals and other directors, as a rehabilitation service, while most teachers would see their role as that of adult educators seeking to develop the whole person. So there's a mixture of attitudes there. These backward developments in penal policy that I've been talking about in thinking and practice are fairly widespread in Europe now, but of course not everywhere. And we refer in the book to this more punitive and restrictive approach as penal climate change, and it does represent an enormous challenge for those trying to provide genuine education for all. However, if you read the early chapters of our book, you will see that the prison leadership in Europe in the 1980s and the 1990s especially held views that are supportive of authentic education for people in prison. For example, here are some statements you will find from Director Generals in Denmark, Netherlands and Hungary in this example, and such people in earlier times. The three quotations here come from Director Generals in three different decades, from the 1970s to the 1990s. The page numbers refer to where we discuss these ideas in the book. For these prison system leaders, prison is inherently damaging to people, and so should be used as a last resort. And education has a capacity to limit that damage. They recognized people in prison as citizens with rights, many of whom come from disadvantaged backgrounds. They therefore felt an obligation to help those in prison grow and develop through education, insofar as that can be done in prison. These leaders treated men and women in prison as subjects, not objects. They felt those in custody should be respected and offered real choices and opportunities. Now, turning to somebody from England. Given the punitive policies and the narrow official role for education within prisons in England these days, it may surprise many that the preeminent European prison leader among that generation I've just been talking about was Kenneth Neal from the Home Office in London. This slide gives a sense of his thinking and values. Neal saw education as deeply development. It had the capacity to sustain people in a kind of coercive environment and prepared them to deal with the difficulties of life once they got outside. It was Kenneth Neal, in his capacity as chair of the Council of Europe's Committee on Crime Problems, who set up and gave broad and holistic terms of reference to the committee which produced education in prison. He also initiated what we now regard in retrospect as the first and second EPEA conferences. And Kenneth Neal also had a major role in shaping the European prison rules. He was chairman of the European body which developed them in 1987. I know there have been revisions since, most recently in 2020, but the same sort of core thinking, the same principles and values are in the European prison rules today. In our book, we refer to the punitive approach that has developed in many places as penal climate change. Prisons are now often hostile environments for authentic education, and educators, if they can get in the door at all, often face enormous challenges. However, if you read the first few chapters of our book, you will see that the earlier prison leadership in Europe held views on penal policy that were very supportive of education in its best sense, and they asserted that all in prison had a right to education. So, a core idea of the EPA is to promote the kind of education set out in the Council of Europe reports, education in prison, and indeed the European prison rules. These emphasize the right all people in prison have to education, as well as an adult education approach, a wide curriculum, and holistic aims. In researching this book, I became more sharply aware than previously how that wide and deep concept of education was given to us by the directors of prison administration, not by education people, but by the leadership of prisons, whose thinking on penal policy and therefore on education within prisons was radically more progressive than many later people in similar roles. That view of holistic education as a right needs to be fought for much more these days, and it is crucial that the EPA is assertive in upholding that progressive approach. We can draw on the thinking of those earlier leaders of European prison systems, on the European prison rules, and on education in prison. Those progressive perspectives, which are in sharp contrast to more recent punitive and restrictive thinking, are also excellently set out by the UN Special Rapporteur on education in prison, Vernon Munoz, but especially a brilliant report by James King of Scotland for the Europris organisation asserts the same thinking, centred on the right to education, and does so perhaps more articulately than earlier Council of Europe reports. We write in some detail about Jim King's report at the end of chapter 4 of our book. We hope that the book, drawing as it does on earlier reports and earlier progressive thinking, will give encouragement to educators in prison settings of many different kinds in many countries. That is why we wrote it. All the very best to you.
So now we should get in contact with Kevin directly. Okay, maybe just a remark. Hello, Kevin. Nice to meet you. Thank you for being with us. It's a pleasure to have you here, and thank you for your PowerPoint presentation on your book you wrote together with your colleagues. So just a remark about the principles of the EPA, and stated in the 70s or 80s or even 90s. What I heard during this conference from all the educators and researchers is a lot about participation, citizenship of incarcerated persons, about the basic right of them to education, and education as a tool for personal growth. So I have the impression that among us educators and researchers, we seem to be really in the same boat, following the principles stated in early times of the EPA. Do you have another impression?
I don't want to be more critical than I suppose we have been in the book. But we have concerns. We've expressed various points in the book about the direction, particularly many countries who've fallen away from involvement in the EPEA, I'm sure that's been rectified a bit at this conference. I've seen the participation list, and there are, countries, people from countries that weren't involved previously, as far as I know, not involved so much, so that's good. But there are still many countries where that used to be involved, there used to be strong involvement in the EPA, and it's not there anymore. And we took the view that when the constitution was changed some years ago, I don't want to go into all of this again, but which essentially limited full involvement with countries which have branches, and there are only 7 of them, that was a regressive step, And I think that, I suppose there are other things about governance of the organization which we were unhappy about. But we've said that in the book. I've said a bit in the slide. And by the way, I'm representing the 4 of us in what I said. I checked over my script with all of the other old guys, and so okay, people. I hope that the organization develops and that it reconnects with places where the connection has been broken, and that it involves people more fully. That'd be good, and I'm glad to hear things are going well at the conference.
So or the steering committee and even the members who were here in the morning at the General Council meeting, we fully agree that many countries are not or underrepresented. So it's really a lot of work ahead of us to integrate more countries, more maybe even support the creation of the national branches, which could be in some countries quite difficult or quite a challenge, but we may find other ways to integrate them better, because it's the desire or the wish, or also the clear will of many people I spoke during this conference, that, for example, the South of Europe could be represented in a much better way than it is actually. So I think there is a quite agreement within the participants here that it should not only be a matter of the northern or central European country, but also in the south. And personally, I know they do a lot of good work also in the south in prison education, and I learned a lot from people in Greece and Spain, so I know what I'm talking about, and so it's really worth to work together with them too, and to integrate them much more intensively. You wrote the book, you looked back 40 years, and I think it was also the opportunity to make sort of a balance. So I may ask you too, what do you think EPEA has achieved in all these years, or thanks to EPEA have been achieved some goals? And on the other hand, what is still to do for the EPEA? What's your vision on this?
Yeah, can I just go back a little bit about what you said about the South? I think that is really important, but also the East. The EPEA came into existence as the Berlin was falling. And by the way, I misspoke in the slide. The Berlin Wall fell in 1989. I think it's in 1981. And in the years following that, there was huge involvement from Eastern European countries. So, as well as the South, I'd like to see that pushed forward. My vision, in a way, it's not for me to have the vision. I think the concept of education that we had, which really I was trying to say in the talk, we took from the Director Generals and senior people in the prison administration that they were very committed to education as a right, to holistic education, and that it should be available to all in prison. And that kind of idea of education as a right is very strongly in the Council of Europe, in the European Prison Rules, and in the United Nations documents. And also in the EU kind of approach, particularly to Alan Smith. So I, other than that, there should be an organization to help, particularly teachers on the ground, and to promote that kind of authentic education, we called it. That I suppose remains the idea. I mean, can be expressed differently, and the concept can be developed. I think Jim King's report, Europe's report, is a very articulate, recent version of that same concept. But you know, it's more challenging, you know, because there's been in some countries, anyway, not all, there's been a much more punitive culture. There's been a sort of demonization of people in prison and in political culture and in public culture. You know, we've had all this get tough on crime, thinking that certainly it's more present in Ireland and it's more present in many countries. And that makes things more difficult, where you know, kind of a narrow concept of rehabilitation is what the neoliberal concept really from the prison authorities and from the political authorities doesn't allow so much room for education.
Okay. You know, my experience is, let's see that among responsible persons in higher positions, there is support for education in prison or education in general for all that they need person, but when I go to a prison, I see that it depends often by the director if the prison education can be implemented or not. And some of them even use education as a privilege if they behave well, and if they're not behave well, so they are excluded. And that's really, sometimes it makes us mad because we have no way to change this.
Yeah, I think it was always like that. Different director generals and different governors or directors of prisons, and I suppose different officers on the landings, and you know, that's one of the difficulties I think prison educators must work with, but that's why they need support and encouragement and possibilities of connecting and so on. And that was Pam Bedford's basic idea about the EPEA, and probably should remain so.
Thanks. So I would offer the microphone for questions. Okay.
Kevin, hi, it's Ruth McFarlane here from England.
Hello, Ruth.
Thank you for your talk. I'm sorry that you couldn't be here with us in Norway. I think you would be really encouraged by the energy and the enthusiasm and the amazing quality of presentations and talks and discussions that we've had. I want to just respond to a point you made in your talk. You said that EPEA committee doesn't know who the members are or how many we have, and we don't have control of the finances. I want to reassure everybody, I know exactly who all of the members are. I have a full list. I have all of the new membership applications coming in, even this morning. I have full sight of all of the bank account. I have a detailed record over the last 5 years of every single transaction. I presented a financial summary this morning. So I just wanted to reassure you that it is all in very good shape.
Okay, good to hear that.
You know, Kevin, I said in my opening speech that this conference could be like a restart of EPA after the pandemic. So it was really some difficult years also for EPA. And therefore, I feel the support of all the participants that we go on this way, in this discussion and this mutual support for our cause. So I'm confident that that we will grow again and be stronger than before in the next future. More questions? Not there.
Hello, Kevin. My name is Helge Norvik. I was just wondering about kind of a bird's eye view of prison education, if I could ask you a question in regards to that, and especially prison education in Europe. And my question is as follows. As far as I understood your speech, you talked about the possibilities of giving education to prisoners had become worse and worse through the years after the 80s, 90s, and so forth. And I think you also mentioned something about the political climate. So I was just wondering, as I've talked to a few people here, and it seems like a lot of the prisons, to me, around Europe, seems to have some overcrowding issues. And also some budget cuts everywhere. Would you say that it would be correct to assume that that's also due to the political climate, and that the political climate has turned more, the political winds has turned more into the punishment part of the whole situation? Or, I don't know, it was quite a rambling question, but...
So although I didn't get your name and I didn't hear all what was being said at the beginning, but I think you're asking about a change in political and penal culture, where more people are put in prison and so on. It's a more punitive culture. Is that correct?
Yes, she took away my microphone. Yes, that was a question I asked.
Yeah, and that's where I suppose my point was that, I mean, some of those attitudes and approaches of overcrowding and making prison austere and so on, they're not new, but I suppose they're more prominent in some places. I don't know. I mean, there's some countries to reduce their prison populations. There's some countries which provide very good conditions and really make efforts to reintegrate people in prisons. But yeah, I think in general, I think the facts are that over recent decades at least, more and more people have been put in prison. And of course, that makes things very difficult. We have quite an overcrowding problem here in Ireland at the moment. You know, I gather it's much the same in England at present. But yeah, and that makes things very difficult and sometimes impossible to provide good, holistic education for everyone.
Thank you.
So, which is why I think we've got to challenge that culture, and we've got to, you know, maybe use things like Munyas's United Nations document and the Council of Europe documents in particular to research and to push as far as we can. for proper education opportunities for all the people in prison.
Another question from a participant.
Thank you. Hi, Kevin. It's Ross Little here from Leicester in England. Thank you. Hey, how you doing? Thank you very much for the presentation. I really enjoyed it. I thought it was really thought-provoking, and it took me back to my first EPEA conference in Vienna in 2017, so 6 years ago. And your presentation then was very formative for me and very influential and very moving, and I found this very moving as well today, so thank you for that. The emphasis on EPEA as a place for prison education practitioners has been mentioned quite a lot in the last couple of days, and it's clearly a really important part of the work. Given your response to the last question and some of the things you said, does it imply that there needs to be more of a lobbying role that EPEA gets involved with to try and influence the decision makers? You were saying 40 years ago that came from the senior prison administrators more than it does today. Is that something that the EPEA needs a stronger role in now to influence?
Hi, Ross. I think, yeah, again, a little of your question I didn't quite get, but I think you were asking if there was a lobbying role for the EPA. Is that correct?
Yes, and whether that needs to be a more prominent feature of the work, yeah.
Sorry, that didn't come across. I think we're having...
Yes. In relation to lobbying.
Maybe the chair can clarify what...
Yes, the question was if how can we influence or lobbying with in the prison system, more in the prison system than in the educational system, and just promote our ideas within the penitentiary world. So how could we do more lobbying, and or as we mentioned before, how could we influence even every governor, prison governor alone, that he does his duties following the recommendations of the Council of Europe?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, how one lobbies, but I've often been in the situation of pointing out to governors or directors generals or you know, others, academics or politicians, you know, that pointing out what's in the European prison rules and in the other council documents. Sometimes it's waved aside. I mean, I'm not saying that cuts through always, but it's one vehicle. I suppose the best argument, and I think, is when you provide good education and people get involved and start learning and developing and so on. When, you know, I think very often when governors see that happening, you know, first of all, it gives them a quieter prison and not quite a happier prison, but they see how people can progress. I mean, that's probably the best argument, but sometimes the documents are a help also, you know. I mean, things like the European prison rules are ignored in lots of ways. I mean, European prison rules say all prisoners should have single cells. Now, I know that may apply in Norway, but half of the prisoners in Ireland don't have that, and I know it's so in other countries. So you know, they find it easy enough to avoid the requirements and the standards in the European prison rules on other issues too. But
Okay.
Other than keep arguing and making the case and asserting that people in prison are members of society and are citizens with rights. And maybe even just in our language, where we should talk about people in prison, or men and women in prison, and not just fall into this language of offender, you know, which is one-dimensional and demonizing, and we sometimes that language is routinely used, but we can just make small assertions by referring to them as people and men and women.
Okay, Kevin, time's running out, and I think we have to stop here. Unfortunately, we could talk another half an hour longer, but we have a dense program. Sorry for that, but thank you very much for being with us. Thank you again that you take the challenge to write the book together with your friends. I'm as a historian, I'm quite pleased about it, to have such a detailed history about what had been in the early times of the EPEA. So thanks a lot for everything you did. Yeah, please.
If I could just say one thing, and your mentioning of being a historian reminds me, Thorfinn Langlade has gathered a huge amount of material, a lot of past conference reports and other documents related to the development of the EPEA and the development of prison education. And they're based in Bergen in Norway, in the State Archive. And I think that is a great benefit to future historians and so on. But thank you also for having me, and thank you very much to Paul and the Norwegian organizers for printing more copies of the book. So I should let you go and have your coffee break now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Stay well. Take care.